Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jim Blight and Janet Lang on the end of the world. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And it's my pleasure every week to welcome a guest into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, to talk about some pressing, urgent item piece of business on the global governance agenda. And today I have two guests for the very first time. Very happy to welcome Jim Blight, CIGI Chair of Foreign Policy Development, and Janet Lang, Research Professor at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. And we're here to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 50th anniversary of which is this month. And specifically, we're here to talk about your new book, the Armageddon Letters, Kennedy, Khrushchev, Castro, in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So welcome, and it's a treat to have you here because I've worked with you for years on this particular topic, and so it's good fun to be able to chat with you publicly about it in this way. So let's talk a bit about the book first. Unusual project, the Armageddon Letters. It's not just a book. It's more than that. Could you give us a little bit of the context and background that led to the publication?
Yes. We have a young colleague, Koji Masatani. He's 20-something. We managed to attract him here from Brown 2.5 years ago when we came up here. It was Koji's idea that if we wanted to reach out and get our message to his generation, or even younger, which is astounding, even younger, he considers himself middle-aged now, I think he's 28, we would need to involve ourselves in something he called a multi-platform transmedia project. It took all dinner and a lot of napkins scribbling to try to explain to us what in the hell he was talking about. So fast forward about 1.5 years, and now we have the book. We have a website that has blogs by very special arrangement. We've gotten Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro to blog for us on the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have graphic art. We have podcasts by the two of us on relevant subjects.
There's wonderful short films where Koji has filmed Jim, and then basically if you go to our website, armageddonletters.com, you get to have a choice of Jim Blight, live in action, looking wonderful, but also animated Jim. This again was Koji's innovation to...
Well, Jim is always animated.
Well, he's always animated, that's true, but now he's animated in the most interesting way. And this was Koji's task, basically to take us, we've, as you know, we've sort of worked on the missile crisis for over 20 years. And Koji's task was to take us from the 20th century, kicking and screaming, into the 21st century. And it's been great fun, but aside from that, we think that with our transmedia project, our goal is to really reach a wider audience, because the issue really is how close we came, as you said, to destroying the world. And it's not a matter, our sense about this book is it's not a matter of understanding it just intellectually. If you understand it intellectually, you might sort of check off and say, well, I did that assignment.
Ooh, that was close.
Yeah, and then on to other things. Our goal is to get you to complement that intellectual understanding with a gut feeling of real fear, what we call heuristic fear, that something needs to be done about the issue of nuclear weapons because they still exist and there still are crises. And if you really understand the missile crisis, we think in a deep way, you'll see that it has enormous implications for current U.S. policy decisions. And so that's our goal, is to get that out into a wider audience.
Now, some of our audience today may remember the missile crisis and some won't. And those who won't remember it won't understand the fear. Walk us back to 1962. What was it like to be there? What was it like to live through the crisis? And in particular, what was it like for the leaders?
With your permission, Dave, I'd like to go back a little further than 1962, at least to the Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961. One of the things that we think, I mean, we discovered for ourselves when we were figuring out how to do this book, we seized on the letters because Castro wrote to Khrushchev, Khrushchev wrote to Castro, Kennedy wrote to Khrushchev, and vice versa. And many of the most interesting, in fact, astounding letters are written in that famous 13 days in late October 1962. But that's not where it began. That's a myth that it began on October 16th. What we actually, it became so obvious to us, we thought, well, how can you study this thing for 25 years and not get this? But Fidel Castro, not later than April 23rd, 1961, draws two conclusions.
Wait, for the audience that doesn't...
I'd love to hold your hand.
Thank you.
Okay.
We've been married for 34 years, so it's perfectly fine. 36 years and counting, actually. I don't even know how to count.
Who's counting?
Back to the Bay of Pigs.
Back to the Bay of Pigs. Most people may not understand what happened in the Bay of Pigs. So in April of 1961, Kennedy allowed a group of Cuban exiles to invade the island. Now, the exiles were, on the one hand, quote, on their own, but they were totally trained and helped and assisted by the CIA. So it was clearly an operation where the U.S. in principle had some deniability, but it was wink, wink. Everybody knew it was a U.S.-sponsored invasion, and Castro certainly knew it was a U.S.-sponsored invasion. And it was a debacle for the exiles and the U.S. Castro's militia very soon, within a couple of days, absolutely overran the exiles. They were either dead, in jail, or in swamps hiding. And so it was, in a sense, a great victory for Castro. It allowed him to consolidate his revolution. But what's interesting, and what Jim's about to tell you, is Castro certainly does celebrate this victory. And that we expected. What we didn't expect is the other thing that he does.
Oh, is that the prompt? Mm-hmm. He makes a speech, and he keeps making the speech every week for the next 18 months. 2 points. One is Kennedy's political future depends entirely on his capacity to liquidate the Cuban Revolution, to destroy the Cuban Revolution, to get rid of its leaders, and to return basically a puppet to the leadership in Havana. The second thing is, and this comes over a year before Khrushchev proposes the missiles. This is in April 1961. The second thing is, he now assumes that if the United States attacks Cuba and invades it with the idea of occupying it, that Khrushchev will destroy the United States in a nuclear attack. Now, there's no missiles in Cuba at this point. He knows virtually nothing about what the nuclear balance is, or even what Khrushchev's attitude is toward some idea like this. But the gist of his speeches is that I have to prepare my people for martyrdom. Now, we've known for 20 years that he did send a letter during the crisis to Khrushchev, which freaked out Khrushchev when he finally had to face what in the world this guy's mindset was like. But it came 18 months before. Khrushchev wasn't listening. Kennedy wasn't listening. Castro had been, in effect, by the time the 13 days arrived, he had been preparing to write this letter to Khrushchev asking him to destroy the United States. He'd been preparing to do that for 18 months, and he couldn't get anybody's attention. So, why does this matter? Because when the missiles are discovered, the Cubans think they have entered the backstretch, the final run-up to Armageddon. They believe that. It accounts for why on the island of Cuba may have been the only place in the world where people knew about the crisis as it was happening and basically went about their business pretty normally because they had no options. War, they didn't choose war. They thought war had been chosen for them. And so, I mean, we've all been on the island.
Resignation, yeah.
Yeah, just, well, you know, it is what it is.
Well, all right, we'll pick up there in just a moment, but we'll be back after this short break. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So just to contextualize, Cuba, and Castro in particular, are preparing themselves for what they see as their inevitable destruction. And they understand it as inevitable because the United States is hell-bent upon achieving it.
That's the key point, Dave.
Nevertheless, Khrushchev and Kennedy are both surprised.
Yeah.
during October 1962. All of a sudden, they find themselves in this situation that neither expected.
Right. And that's
what's
actually
the explanation here for the disjunction?
That's the real key, is that they're so far apart. So basically, again, let's go back a second to the Bay of Pigs. And what you have here is that after the Bay of Pigs, Castro is convinced that the next time there'll be an invasion, the U.S. will come with all it has, that it won't just be the exiles, that it will it will really be an attempt to totally destroy Cuba and basically to enact regime change. He's convinced of that. It's just a matter of time. It's not if, it's when.
If I may, he's not irrational.
Right.
If he looks around him, what his intelligence people are telling him is that a good part of the United States Air Force and Navy is rather rapidly collecting around his island. That Homestead Air Force Base now has B-52s, that Miami International Airport has B-52s, that buildings are being blown up in Cuba every week via the covert action program called Operation Mongoose, which to the Americans was sort of small potatoes, but to the Cubans was thought to be the preliminary phase of the Big Bang.
So that's part of the issue. If you put yourself on the island of Cuba, it looks like war is inevitable. Now, what's interesting is that it doesn't look that way in Washington. Basically, Kennedy, after the Bay of Pigs, remember, he makes a very important and a difficult decision that when the Bay of Pigs invasion by the exiles is going sour, he's got the Marines close by, but he says no. He does not want to insert U.S. combat troops there. He draws a line prior to that. So in his mind, he's saying, Cuba is a real pain in the neck. I really wish we had somebody besides Castro. Let's do what we can to aggravate him. But there's no way that we're going to send in troops. But there's no way that Castro can know that. So the two mindsets are so off. Khrushchev also...
But Kennedy also believes there's no way that Khrushchev is going to send strategic nuclear weapons to Cuba.
Yeah.
He never has. Right, in the history of the Soviet Union, and as they've had these buildups, they've certainly had conventional buildups outside the borders of the Soviet Union. They have never even considered it for the Eastern Front. So why would they imagine that they would do it here? So absolutely, you have sort of three mindsets that are in totally different places here.
Bubbles.
Bubbles.
Bell jars.
In fact, in our book, we have a chapter called Sleepwalk, which sort of tries to illustrate that in the 18 months before the culmination of the missile crisis, the three leaders really are hermetically sealed.
So they're all three rational.
Of course.
But
Yeah, I think so.
they all are basically mistaken.
Exactly.
Operating on the basis of faulty information.
That's exactly
Why?
the point. Well, in part because,
May I?
yes.
As you know, our distant background is in cognitive psychology, and we usually don't emphasize this, but when you look at this period of buildup and the distance that separated the mindsets of these three guys, I think almost inevitably you fall back on a concept like denial. It wasn't as if nobody was thinking that Khrushchev would put missiles into Cuba, but at the top of the Kennedy administration, they realized that if he did this kind of unbelievable thing that some people, including the CIA director McCone, eventually thought they would, how are we going to respond? If they put nuclear missiles in Cuba and they happen to be operational, I mean, do you attack them and take the chance that you lose Atlanta, Miami, New Orleans, and maybe even Washington, D.C.? Well, probably not, but then your political career is over if you don't get rid of it. If you don't, so he's not going to do it. It'd be way too stupid to do it because he'd know. Khrushchev is in some kind of bubble land himself because he actually, we know from Sergei Khrushchev, our colleague and friend from Brown, that Khrushchev thought Kennedy would kind of accommodate himself to this. He would understand at a certain point, you put missiles into Cuba, that gives us, the Soviets, about the same amount of sort of accurate firepower that the Americans have, and then we don't have to fight anymore. Then we can start really reducing on the basis of equality.
And anyway, the Americans have missiles in Turkey.
And they have missiles in Turkey and Italy and Britain and so forth, the NATO missiles, yes. And so it fair's fair. Fair's fair, yes. Well, it is in some games, but it doesn't happen to work this way in the Cuban Missile Crisis because it didn't seem fair. Except ultimately it seemed kind of fair to Kennedy. Late in the crisis, 26th, 27th of October 1962, the group around Kennedy, the ex-com, is we've got to do this, we got to attack, no we can't attack, well, they've got the quarantine line up, but what we can't keep that up there forever, and so forth. It turns out that Khrushchev sends a letter at some point asking Kennedy to please consider the fact that you have missiles in Turkey, and if you would take them out, that would sweeten the deal for us to take them out of Cuba, in addition to your pledge not to invade Cuba and to let the Cuban Revolution proceed on its own. It's funny because Kennedy thinks, you know, I mean, people are going to say that's a pretty good offer. And then there's this wonderful exchange on the Kennedy tapes, which anybody can read and anyone can listen to now online. One of the very few, possibly the only exchange on the tapes directly between Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy says, if there's anybody around after this war, and they figure out that you could have avoided the war by getting rid of this useless junk in Turkey, then I don't think we're going to have a very good war. I mean, I don't think the evaluation of our action is going to be very good. Johnson's response to this is pure Johnson, and it's even spoken in the language of his indigenous only to his brain, in which he says, you're going to crumple. The people who did the transcript of the tapes for years were trying to figure out what he was saying. Crumble? No, crumble, it's sort of related to it, but a Texasism is crumple. You're going crumple. Means, you know, like a puppet, the strings are cut like that. And he wasn't happy about it. So, and I think Johnson actually represented the majority of the advisors at that point. We owe Kennedy a debt of gratitude as a crisis manager for facing down this group of people.
Very good. We'll be back again in a moment with Jim Blight and Janet Lang. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. All right, so Soviets deploy missiles to Cuba, try to sneak them in. Americans discover them. Khrushchev's shocked that they discover them. Kennedy's shocked that there are missiles in Cuba. All of a sudden, in a relatively short space of time, Kennedy and Khrushchev managed to get on the same wavelength. They managed to find a way out of this peacefully. Mm-hmm. How'd they do that?
Well, yeah, this is really interesting because initially, and it's right that you say, in a relatively short time, it's not zero time, because they both start out shocked and angry at the other. So,
and belligerent.
And very belligerent. So Khrushchev and his many allies, associates, have been lying to Kennedy all through the summer, even in the days before Kennedy's speech to the nation about the discovery of the missile crisis. They've been saying, we don't need to put bases in Cuba, we certainly won't put missiles there. And so Kennedy is outraged that he's been lied to and that Khrushchev has done this to him. And his first sort of reaction is, well, we just got to take them out, and is initially thinking in a military way. Now, Khrushchev also, when he sort of...
We just learned this last week. A graduate student at Yale tried to count the number of people Khrushchev had to lie to in order to pull this off. It's in triple figures. Yeah. And almost all of them are Russians. They're almost all in the Foreign Service, some even in the low parts of the military, some in the intelligence service, who were told falsehoods so they could lie much more effectively because they thought they were telling the truth.
So partly it's secret channels that Kennedy really trusted that are also lying, Dobrynin to Kennedy's brother. So Kennedy's really quite upset initially, and knows that this is really a difficult thing because he's drawn a line that said they can't do this. Khrushchev, when he gets word that Kennedy is going to have his speech and is going to have the quarantine there, he is just outraged as well, and initially thinks, well, we're just going to run the blockade. I mean, this is an act of war, an act of piracy. We're an equal superpower. They can't treat us this way. Now, what happens, I think, which is very important, and both Kennedy and Khrushchev need a lot of our appreciation for how they managed this crisis. Basically, they both appreciate the nuclear dimension. They look into what Jim has called, in a sense, the shattered crystal ball. That is, it's very hard to predict the future. None of us are good at it. But when it comes to nuclear, we can predict that if one nuclear bomb goes off,
it'll ruin your whole day.
It'll ruin your whole day.
I think what happens is that Kennedy and Khrushchev more or less simultaneously have the living daylights scared out of them. And what they're afraid of is that they can't control their own people, first of all. They can't control their boats. The boats aren't exactly where they're supposed to be. The planes overflying places where they're not supposed to be. Lines of communication don't seem to be either as effective or secure as people said they would be. What they learned...
Chains of command breaking down.
Breaking down,
and
yes.
Remember, both of these leaders had experience in World War II. So they knew firsthand that war, once you start some military action, it is not predictable. They know that. Now, but lots of people who are advising them know that. Everybody is, at that point, was sort of a veteran of World War II. What Kennedy and Khrushchev critically add to the mix is that they take this notion of the fog of war and really insert the nuclear issue in there. And once they do that, they're horrified. And then their goal is to back away.
Why is Castro not horrified?
Castro. I think you don't understand much of anything about this crisis until you get to the island. Because Castro is on he's in a different dimension than they are. He's not afraid. He's not worried about things getting out of control. He feels, I have no control. I haven't had any control. And I'm not about to get any control over this. The Americans can control when they attack us, but they certainly are going to attack us. Now, after the missiles are discovered, it looks like he's a prophet, because then all kinds of stuff starts to happen. Kennedy makes a speech, and that night they begin these low-level overflights at 600 miles an hour, 45 to 50 feet off the ground. Windows are blowing out of buildings, scaring the daylights out of people, and every time one of these planes comes over, the Cubans have to assume this is when the war starts right now.
Now, it's also really important, if you get back to ground zero in Cuba, that it's not just the Cubans. There are 43,000 Soviet troops there. And what's very interesting is that those 43,000 Soviet troops in Cuba essentially have the same mindset as the Cubans. They are on that wavelength. They are not on Khrushchev's wavelength at all. So basically, if you appreciate what it's like being at ground zero, where you believe an attack is coming that you don't have control over, that's fundamentally different than being in Washington and Moscow, where you have some control. You don't think you have all the control that you want, and you're nervous and pull back.
And Castro's smart enough to pick up on the fact that Khrushchev's getting wobbly as the week goes on, the public week of the crisis.
Oh.
And he sits down and he writes him a letter designed to buck up his courage.
Absolutely.
Right. Now that backfires in a very positive way for the fate of the world.
I think so, yeah.
Absolutely.
The letter, so he shows up at the Soviet embassy at 3 a.m., actually the morning of 27 October, the letter's always dated 26 for some reason. 3 a.m., he gets Alexeyev, the ambassador, out of bed, and they go down in the bunker underneath the embassy, and Castro says, I got to write a letter to Khrushchev. 10 drafts, 10, count them, 10 drafts of this letter, and finally Alexeyev says, what are you trying to say? Are you trying to say that you want Comrade Khrushchev to nuke the United States of America? And according to Alexeyev's memoirs, and Fidel as well, Fidel says, not exactly that.
Not directly.
Directly. But if they should invade the island with the idea of occupying it, that would be the moment to solve this problem once and forever, ... nuke the United States and destroy them. We're going down. We're going down, but we're going down anyway. However terrible the solution may be, for there is no other. That's more or less a quote. When Khrushchev gets this letter, he's in a meeting with his Presidium colleagues, and they are not happy about what's going on. They're fighting with each other and so forth. And Oleg Troyanovsky, his aide for the U.S. and for Foreign Affairs, comes in and says, Troyanovsky's hands are shaking. He says, there's one other thing, sir. There's a letter from Comrade Fidel. And he said, okay, read it. And Khrushchev, according to some people who were there and his son, stands up and says, "This is insane. Fidel is trying to drag us into the grave with him." That's it. That's it. Pull the plug. Missiles are coming out. Nobody does anything without my signature. Done. Now, one of the, I think, inadvertently hilarious parts of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that poor General Pliev, the field commander in Cuba, has only hours before finally got everything ready to go, ready for war.
He's been working 24/7.
24 hours a day, and then suddenly he gets a message that says, take them down, put them back in the crates, put them on the boats, and take them back to the Soviet Union. I would love to have been in the room when he got that order.
That's right, absolutely. We'll be back one last time with Jim Blight and Janet Lang. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So, 50th anniversary of the missile crisis. What's the lesson? What's the takeaway? What should we as scholars draw from this, and what should leaders draw from this?
Okay, so we've sort of thought about this in that way, about takeaways and lessons, and we have sort of three of each. So I'll run through very quickly our takeaways, and then Jimmy, you want to do the lessons?
I'll clean up the table with what's left over.
All right, so our takeaways. Basically, one of the things that we feel very strongly is that we need to appreciate now that Armageddon is possible. I mean, that's a horrible thing to say, but
at least one guy thought it was inevitable.
Yeah, exactly. We don't have to go to science fiction. You don't have to just go to fiction and poetry and whatnot.
So in the Cold War, we all knew that.
Actually,
people have forgotten this?
People actually,
Yes,
I think,
exactly.
a lot during many periods of the Cold War were apathetic and thought that sort of the numbers balance made us safer and whatever. It doesn't. There was overwhelming superiority for the U.S. Didn't matter a tit or jottle. So Armageddon is possible. Second takeaway, what's even more troubling is Armageddon is possible even if no one wants it. I mean, that basically the fact that Khrushchev and Kennedy didn't want it wasn't comforting. That wasn't enough.
Well, Castro didn't want it either. He just didn't think he had a choice in the matter.
Exactly. So the other final takeaway is that if you put these two together, if you have nuclear weapons and Armageddon is possible even if no one wants it, you get the very weird conclusion that at some point Armageddon is going to be inevitable unless you really act to push back, and that gets us to our lessons.
Well, 2, 3. How many? Oh, well, yeah, sure, okay. We've become, in the process of the last 4 or 5 years, I think, we were much closer to McNamara's view on nuclear weapons, which is driven by this conviction that, you know, sooner or later, now it's not logically inevitable, but sooner or later stuff happens, things will go wrong, and so forth. So we ought to try to get rid of them. Now, what kind of a world would you have to build in order to actually get rid of all or almost all the nuclear weapons? That's a tough task. It's going to take a while, but it's going to take longer if we don't start thinking about it.
I mean, the political mechanisms are in place. International mechanisms are in place, but there's no political will.
Yeah,
and so part of what we hope to do is to encourage people to care about this, to start a sort of system where there is a spread of political will.
The last 10 years we were at Brown University, which correspond to the 2000s, a majority of our senior international relations concentrators taking the honors seminar with us, had trouble placing the Cuban Missile Crisis in the proper decade, but more importantly, B, thought that the nuclear problem was already solved because the Cold War ended. They actually thought that. These are very privileged, educated kids. So there's a lot to be done. Second lesson, you're going to have to find a way to get people not to remember it in the sense of they experienced it before, but to focus on the fact that it happened, and that they should pay more attention to how close it came to nuclear war than how lucky they were to get out of it. The final thing, which connects with one of our obsessions these days, is that you would, you would think the United States of America would have learned this lesson a long time ago, but small countries that apparently are militarily weak and poor and not in a good position to resist a superpower, they can drag you down if conditions are right. Now, you'd think that after the Vietnam War, this would be sort of a matter of sort of common wisdom, but it's not, and the proof that it's not is the way that the United States is dealing with Iran right now. I mean, Iran is a country of 80 million people with a long history of martyrdom. The Shiites have thought for generations, hundreds of years actually, that their ultimate fate, some of them anyway, that their ultimate fate is to go down as martyrs, like the Imam Ali. So you need to be careful when you're messing around with smaller countries. Cuba was treated like lint by the Kennedy administration. You whack them a little bit, you ignore them the rest of the time. Cuba was treated like lint by the Soviets. The Cubans said you should do this publicly because the Americans will really come at you. Khrushchev said, oh, that's nice. He treated the Cubans, I would say, like children, like small children.
One of the things that really evolves, I think, in line with this into a clear lesson is one mistake that Kennedy made. And that is Kennedy was very well aware and was explicit with his colleagues about not pushing Khrushchev into a corner. He made sure that he had exit routes. He had no clue about that Castro needed an exit route as well, and he gave him none. And so part of that third lesson is that with smaller, weaker, poorer adversaries, especially with smaller, weaker, poorer adversaries that have weapons of mass destruction, give them exit routes, for heaven's sakes. Very, very important. And we don't see a lot of evidence for that.
Absolutely. One small footnote, you were there as well. Castro eventually did learn. It took a few decades.
Yes.
But he eventually got the message.
Yes, he did. Yeah, in fact, he's Cuba's version of Robert S. McNamara right about now.
Actually, in 2010, he goes on YouTube, and you should check it out. It's actually
October 15th, 2010. It's the last entry in the book.
Letter in our book, in the chapter called Hope. He goes on very passionately, actually, to talk about.
He doesn't say that a lot.
Nuclear abolition.
That's right.
So yeah.
That's right. Well, fascinating. Thank you for coming in, and to our audience, thank you for joining us. And please, when you have an opportunity, check out the companion website for the project we've been discussing, www.armageddonletters.com. And join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.